Hi, everyone. Welcome to Shakespeare & Co.'s Writing the Short Story, Reading and Q&A. Currently, we have three authors here. We hope Elizabeth Collin will join us true. She's the author of True Ash. But here we have Michelle Blair Walker. Wilker, I'm sorry. A little nervous. She is the author of Chain Link Stories, published by Post Hill Press. We have Jacob M. Appel. He's the author of The Amazing Mr. Morality Stories, published by Vandalia Press. And finally, Bradley J. Owens, the author of How I Met You, a collection of 15 short stories published by Bright Horse Books. I personally love short stories, and I also love small presses. It's not to say they're small, but it just means they got big hearts. So, as is, let's have a round of applause for our authors. Michelle, you're the closest to the mic. Would you like to go for that first?
Chain Link is a collection of short stories that examines connection, kind of on any level, between your family, your friends, teachers, country, maybe dating or something like that. I'm going to read the short story Mac. The empty classroom smelled of clay and paper mache. It was musty, thick, and cool. Mac breathed in the aroma. He wanted to imprint its essence into his brain. He took 2 shallow breaths, basking in the simplicity of it. It was funny how glue and dirt could make you smile. The lights were off, but through the large window panes, he could see the sun creep its way lower and lower. It was a tiny sliver, but sparkled and left a golden-orange hue on the center table. He continued to straighten up, pushing in tiny wooden chairs and picking up wayward paintbrushes and pieces of charcoal. His hands were full of multicolored speckles and chalk dust. They shook a little as he grabbed the last brush. Mac, you old coot, he said to himself, as he dropped them in the sink. The water was a rainbow-garbled puddle. He limped a little as he made his way. That bum knee injury from Korea and the extra weight he gained over the last 10 years made it tricky for cleanup. He was slow as honey on a hot summer day. Damn those oatmeal cookies. He just couldn't resist, especially when they were baked just right, not too chewy and not too crispy. Tessa would probably bring him another batch when she came down from high school to take him to dinner. He packed up his desk, placing the contents into a cardboard banker's box. He laid the calligraphy pens on top of his sketch pads and Princeton brushes. Most of the desk contained junk, loose papers, and pencil drawings, so he shuffled them into the wastebasket below. He opened the side closet and pulled out his worn leather satchel. There was a mirror on the interior, and he gazed at his reflection. His white hair dipped into a large swirl, and he pushed his thick black glasses up the bridge of his nose. God, he was fat. What did he expect? He was 70 years old, for Christ's sake. He took out his navy cable knit cardigan and yanked down a picture of Oliver, his pug. He tossed them both on top of the satchel and slammed the closet door shut. It vibrated back and forth and didn't close, but he didn't care. Mr. McDonald, how are you doing? Mac turned. Eleanor Zimmerman was waiting at the door. Her blonde hair was tied up in a neat French twist, and she wore a gray sweater draped over her shoulders. She was clutching a rectangular box. Hello, Eleanor. I'm managing just fine. Thank you very much. What the hell did she want? He wasn't in the mood for the PTA. He groaned and attempted a weak smile. Do you need something? I'll leave the keys on the counter by the sink on my way out. He packed up the last remaining items on the desk. Oh no, don't worry about that. I brought you a little gift from the PTA. Boy, we're going to miss you. She took a few tentative steps into the classroom and let out a nervous chuckle. It was high-pitched like a hyena, and he could see that she had lipstick stains on her teeth. She outstretched her toothpick arms and offered him the box. Mac blushed. He felt a bit guilty for being crabby, but not that guilty. He was old and tired, and this retirement business was quite draining. Thanks, Eleanor. You guys shouldn't have. He took the box and bowed his head. Open it! She was now biting on her bottom lip and rocking back and forth on her heels. Okay. Max shuffled over to the counter and plopped the box down. He pried it open with the X-Acto knife he carried in the left breast pocket of his baby blue smock. He sliced it along each taped side, creating a crooked line. He pulled off layers of bubble wrap to see an 8x10 black and white photo on mat board. It was encased in a simple black frame. The photo was of him and some of his students from the 1960s. He was leaning over a sketch pad, and 4 of the boys were watching him as he drew. He was a lot thinner, but still had the same swoop in his hair, thick glasses, and smock. The text underneath was in a flowery calligraphy. It read, Duncan P. McDonald, Art Teacher Emeritus, 1954 to 1991. Mac ran his fingers over the glass. He saw his old man reflection on top of his younger self. He took his glasses off and squinted to see if he could remember the names of any of the students, but he was too old and his memory was shot. This was back when the school had only boys. They were dropped off in wood-paneled station wagons at the main hall turnaround. They had to wear a jacket and tie and shake the headmaster's hand every morning. Those were the good old days when kids had manners and respect. Where had the time gone? What had he done with his life? Taught a bunch of rich prep school brats. Do you like it? Eleanor was leaning over his shoulder. He could feel her warm breath on the back of his neck. I just love that photo. We're going to hang one up in the checkerboard lobby. It's great, Max said. Really, thank the PTA and the board. He touched his heart and closed his eyes. We're really going to miss you. She patted him on the back like he was a kindergartner. Who was the man in that photo? Did he still exist? And who was going to care when he was gone? He was just a dumb middle school art teacher. Mac! Tessa had a backpack fastened to both shoulders and was carrying a small polished blue tin. Her auburn curly hair was tied up in a loose ponytail. Hi, Tessa. We heard you're going to Yale next fall. Congrats. Thanks, Mrs. Zimmerman. Hey, kiddo. Mac pointed at Eleanor, making the cuckoo sign. Her back was to him. She turned and he quickly clasped his hands in front. Tessa giggled. Well, Mr. McDonald, enjoy the photo. Thanks for everything you've done. I don't know what we'll do without you. Thanks, Eleanor. I'm sure you guys will figure it out. Bye, Tessa. Drop us a line when you get to Connecticut. Eleanor readjusted the gray merino and glided out of the classroom, clicking her heels against the linoleum. Hey, a visit from the PTA, now that's big. Tessa strolled in and handed him the blue tin. This better not be what I think it is. He plucked the lid off and tugged at a layer of wax paper. It smelled of cinnamon and raisins. How am I going to marry a rich grandma if you keep making me fat? I will ration myself to 1 a day to make them last. You always say that. Her blue eyes looked vivid and bright. Mac never had any kids of his own, but if he had a granddaughter, he would have imagined her to be just like Tessa. You still pulling that one? Tessa pointed to the blackboard where a closed mouth catches no flies was written over and over in a neat curlicue script. The Cunningham kid kept mouthing off, so I gave him a project. I love that you never change. I feel awful for all the kids who don't get to have you. Oh, they won't even know the difference. He took a cookie out and crunched in. Perfection. Mac, don't eat one now. You'll ruin your appetite. She had her arms folded in front and shook her head. But she had a slight grin. She had such a pretty smile. Perfect straight teeth. He waved her off and continued to chew. He brushed crumbs off his chin and placed the tin in the banker's box. Tessa sat down on the stool by the counter and began to spin. So, smarty pants, Yale. You're going to forget about little old me when you go off to college with the big shots. Mac lowered himself onto the stool next to her. His knees creaked and his big belly rested on his thighs. I'll never forget you, Mac. She stopped spinning and leaned her elbow onto the counter. Her face was loaded with freckles. I don't want to go to Yale. I'm going to be the dumbest one there. I bet they made a mistake and meant to accept another Tessa Clark. She glanced down and tapped her tennis shoe on the rim of the stool's base. She still had her backpack strapped on, hunched over like a large sea turtle. Oh, Tessa, don't say that. You're at the beginning of your journey. This will be a new challenge. You will do your best as you always do. Give each new experience your best, but be happy with your success and happy in yourself. That's all you can do. Mac shrugged and patted her forearm. Tessa nodded, but was still looking down at her tennis shoes. Listen to me. I'm an old fart and I know better. Okay, thanks, Mac. You're the best. Her eyes were a bit dewy, but not a drop of liquid escaped. She sighed, managed a slight smile, and gave him a tiny punch on the shoulder. What he wouldn't give to switch places with her. There was so much to look forward to, and here he was living in the rearview mirror. This kid was going places. She was such a smart cookie and so sweet. There was nothing she couldn't accomplish. He was sure of it. He couldn't say the same about himself. He was at the end. It was too late to fix past mistakes. He felt like an old jalopy running out of steam. He would just putt-putt his way to whatever was left. Mac wasn't feeling sorry for himself. It was just a statement of facts. It was what it was. Mac, do you guys still make papier-mâché animals and paint copies of the Mona Lisa? Yep, it's funny to see what the new kids come up with. One kid made a Mickey Mouse Mona Lisa. That's a good one. So what's next for you? Are you going to travel and take exotic vacations, drink pina coladas, and lounge by the pool? What was he going to do? He had no family, no hobbies to speak of. Me and Oliver are going to hightail it down to South Beach and pick up some widows. We're going to take shuffleboard and play bingo on Sunday nights. No, really, what will you do? She went back to her stool spinning. Actually, I'm not quite sure. He was surprised that he had said it out loud. Well, you should definitely do something fun. That Miami scenario isn't half bad. Just think about all you can do. You have a new journey ahead of you, too. Well, I don't know about that. I do. Expect a postcard from Miami with a picture of you and Oliver relaxing under a large rainbow umbrella. She glared at him. He nodded thoughtfully and smiled, but just to make her feel better. Hey, we should probably head to dinner. I'm going to pull the car around. Tessa hopped off the stool and headed over to Mac's desk, where she grabbed the banker's box and clutched it low by her thighs. You coming? Yeah, give me a minute. I gotta grab a few things. I'll meet you out front. Mac placed both hands on his knees and made his way to standing. Those stools were not the easiest to disembark from. Tessa began to skip in the direction of the door. When she reached the frame, she whirled. The contents of the banker's box clinked together lightly. You were the best teacher I ever had. She flashed him her lovely smile and then continued on. Mac stood alone in the middle of his classroom. He had a large lump at the base of his throat, and he felt a few unruly tears trickle down his wrinkled, plump cheek. The classroom was now dark as the sun had set completely. Lights from the parking lot cast various shadows on the work tables, and yet at the same time illuminated the paint supplies and kiln. He couldn't move an inch. He closed his eyes for a minute and began to take in a few substantial breaths. His lips were moist and he could taste the salt from the teardrops on the tip of his tongue. He flipped his eyes open and limped his way over to the desk. He unbuttoned the baby blue smock and packed it in the tan satchel. He lugged the navy cardigan on and rolled up the sleeves to 3/4. The dagger and thistle tattoo on his right forearm was now visible. He picked up the 8x10 photo of his younger self and stared at it for a minute before tossing the classroom keys on the counter. They slid across the smooth surface and made a loud spiraling clank as they traveled. He stood in the doorway to take one last glance around. Such a familiar sight, but also so foreign. He didn't belong here anymore. He took a final inhalation of the stale dirt and glue and shuffled his way outside the classroom. He faced the door and tugged on the brass knob to shut it with a tiny, insignificant click.
Hi again. Thank you so much, Michelle Wilker. One of my favorite parts about writing is it's always a quiet reminder that the person who we really are isn't so much how we perceive ourselves. It's often, in this day and age, cliche way, the memory we leave for others, so to speak. That said, Mr. Bradley J. Owens, would you come up to the stand and
Come on up, I'm on my way.
Bradley will, I believe, are you doing?
I'm the oldest one on the panel, you gotta give me old.
Oh, okay, that's cool. Just
Thank
watch
you.
out for the grasshopper over here.
Okay, I'm gonna watch out for the grasshopper, thanks. First, I just want to thank everybody who has put the effort in to organize this festival. I know that it's a lot of work and there are a lot of volunteers involved. I want to thank Shakespeare & Co. for hosting this particular event and my fellow panelists, short story writers. And I want to thank you for being here. It wouldn't be nearly as fun if all those chairs were empty, believe me. My book is called How I Met You, and the stories in the book were written over a long period of time. So they're very different in setting, subject matter, tone, and style. For the most part, they're set in places that I know very well. They're set in West Texas, where I grew up. They're set in Las Vegas, where I went to high school. They are set in California, where I went to college and where I've lived for most of the last 40 years. And they are set in Haiti, where I was a foreign service officer in the early 1980s. So you can look at that as a good thing, because if you don't like one story, you can move on to another one, or you can look at it as a messy potpourri. I'm going to read from the last story in the book, which is one of the Las Vegas stories. And the story is called Leap from Milk. And in the context of the story, that word leap from milk refers to a sweet German wine. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. Leap from milk. In my family, we named our pets for liquor. We had dogs named Brandy and Tequila. We had a cat named Vodka, to whom I was allergic. We even had a minor bird once for a short while, who we called Johnny Walker. Vodka died one Christmas while we were away visiting my grandparents. The neighbor found her, wrapped her in a plastic bag, and put her in our freezer, where she stayed until the ground was soft enough in spring to bury her. One night, I found my sister out there in the garage, standing in her nightgown with the freezer door wide open, looking in on Vodka. It was weird. My sister standing in the freezer light, her breath making clouds. "Victoria," I whispered. "Vicky?" But as she heard me, she didn't turn around. I went back to bed and left her there. That was our last winter in Amarillo. We moved that June to Las Vegas, where my father had been hired to be the comptroller of a private hospital just a few blocks off the Strip. Famous people used to come there sometimes, entertainers. I realize now that most of them were there for plastic surgery or detox, but my father never mentioned anything about their illness. He'd just say that so-and-so had checked in for a few days, and he'd pass on to us the opinion of the staff. This one was a prima donna, that other one was down to earth. I wondered what words the staff used to describe my father. Exacting was the word my mother favored. "Your father's an exacting man," she'd tell us over dinner, arching one eyebrow ironically to let us know that she meant more than she was saying. This was her response to any incidental criticism he might level at her or at us, ranging from the price or tenderness of that night's pork chops to the quality of Vicky's posture at the table to my imperfect grammar. My mother's arched eyebrow was shorthand, and we took its meaning. I am not wounded by such criticisms, and you should not feel wounded either. "Guilty as charged," my father would say every time. "Now tell me, Judge, where might I go to pay my fine?" She would tap the corner of her mouth with one long painted fingernail, and he would get up, walk around the table, and kiss her very formally on that spot. My father wasn't handsome, but he had winning ways. People should have been intimidated by his size, 6'2", 280 pounds. But there was something in his bearing or expression that made strangers walk right up to him and start conversations. I saw this happen all my life, in grocery stores and banks, in movie theaters and airports. They would tell him things about themselves, and he would listen, as if this was what he'd come there for. to hear them talk about their stiff joints or their bunions, their lost opportunities, their piddling triumphs, their troubles with their wives or kids or with the law. With women, he was sly and courtly, giving them the full-on treatment, as my mother called it, bearing down on them with all of his considerable charm. Women seemed to recognize that this was ceremony, not seduction, and most were glad to play along, teasing him or turning diffident, taking on the role of temptress or coquette, looking up at him from hooded eyes, provocative or pure as driven. He did not discriminate between the pretty women and the plain ones. I once saw him sweep a 90-year-old woman off her feet at her birthday party. He held her close and danced her through the tables in the banquet room of the Red Barn in Amarillo, singing Stardust in her ear until the record on the jukebox ran out. Then he walked her back to her chair with his arm around her waist, and before she sat down, she turned and kissed him on the cheek. You could see from 20 feet away that she was blushing. At work, my father was all business in his pressed white half-sleeve shirts and narrow dark ties, his creased trousers. He embodied the idea of the perfectly straight line. He kept his fingernails cut close and straight across, his sideburns squared off at his temples. The hair on the back of his head appeared to have been trained to stop growing 2 inches above his collar. In the pockets of his shirts, he carried scraps of paper on which he had made lists in pencil, and his letters were precise and angular, almost cuneiform. They looked like the tracks that certain beetles leave in sand. I think about the sound my father's hard-soled shoes made. Sorry. There are moments where you get a little overwhelmed. People sometimes are concerned, including people in my family, that I'm writing about them. And in some ways I am, and in some ways I'm not. The characters step forward and they become their own people, so they're not necessarily the people that I'm writing about. But those people haunt these pages. I think about the sound my father's hard-soled shoes made coming down the hospital's waxed corridors. He spent his life in hospitals and probably grew deaf to that sound, but it was part of him, an attribute. An attribute that adheres permanently to my image of him. And it makes me wonder how much of what surrounds us we take on, how much of it becomes us without our knowing. Thank you.
It's me again. What's up? Thank you, Bradley, for sharing. It's always a reminder that has to be said. And you brought up that point mid-talk about there's a separation between the characters we write and the author himself. We often use that medium to explore the impressions of memory and things like that. So it's always something we have to keep in mind when we look back into ourselves and explore that. And without further ado, our final speaker is Jacob M. Appel. Come on up. Thank you for the books, by the way.
Thank you, and you hear me? Good? Thank you for having me. You really do have, I come in from New York every year, maybe the best book festival in the country, even though you may not realize that here. You should be very proud of that. Every year Garth orders my books, and every year he ships them back, and I am grateful for that too. But I remember the roughest talk I had here was, I think it was 3 years ago. This brilliant woman who's a wildlife rehabilitator came and brought her hawk to the bookstore. There is nothing you can say after someone has brought a live raptor to a bookstore that anybody wants to hear. So I'm glad we're at the beginning. It makes it much easier. I will tell you one brief anecdote about me, and then I will read a bit from the story I am most known for, if I'm known for anything. About a year ago in New York, I'm about to read at an event, and a very well-dressed woman of a certain age comes up to me, and she's so thrilled to meet me, and she says she's driven 2 hours to meet me. And I'm thinking, I'm a psychiatrist in my other life, I'm thinking, this woman must be crazy. And then she tells me she's read everything I've ever written, and now I know she's crazy. But after about 30 seconds, it becomes clear she's read nothing I've ever written. She's read everything written by a different author of the same name. The 2 key points of that are, if you're here for a different Jacob Appel, now is your chance to sneak out. But also, that is why I use my middle initial, and it is why if you email me, which you are welcome to do, I'm going to read a portion of this story from this book, Einstein's Beach House. If you email me, which is my full name, jacobappel@gmail.com, or you can look me up online, I will send you a PDF of the rest of the story and the entire collection. If you don't include the M, it goes to the other author. And he may or may not write something nice back at this point. That being said, I'm going to read the beginning of a story called La Tristesse des Hérissons. That is partially based on a true story, but the subjects don't know that. So if you know them, don't tell them. We'd been living together for 8 months when we adopted the hedgehog. I'd wanted a German Shepherd or a Doberman Pinscher, a fearless, intimidating animal that could accompany me jogging in the park late at night. Adeline wanted a baby. Neither of us had ever mentioned anything about hedgehogs. But then Adeline read an article on unconventional pets, a throwaway piece in the back of a complimentary airline magazine. And soon enough, I found myself wheeling a 4-foot-long glass tank into the service elevator on a dolly. Hedgehogs require their space. It turned out that they also prefer warm, arid climates. So Adeline demanded that we install a convective heater and a dehumidifier in the living room. Outside, it was a balmy May in Manhattan. Inside, our apartment sweltered like the Kalahari. Adeline named the hedgehog Orion, and for 3 days, the prickly little devil entertained us by devouring mealworms and burrowing under aspen chips and exploring a makeshift maze that Adeline fashioned from cereal boxes. According to the Happy Hedgehog Handbook, responsible owners challenge their hogs with intellectual puzzles 5 times daily. My girlfriend followed the guide's countless do's and don'ts with a fundamentalist zeal. Though I wasn't as smitten with the creature myself, I was delighted to see Adeline in such bright spirits for the first time since her mother's stroke. We didn't argue all weekend, and our sex life rekindled, although Adeline constantly reminded me to keep our volume at a minimum, fearful that an errant moan might alarm our barbed roommate. Actually, the word she used wasn't alarm, it was traumatize. I could envision her writing me up, just as she does the prospective parents she interviews during her home visits for the adoption agency. Domicile unsuitable for placement, poor boundary maintenance, hedgehog likely to be exposed to sounds of sexual intercourse and to be emotionally traumatized. So I screwed like a deaf mute. Sunday was my late night at the restaurant. I co-own a bistro and wine bar with 2 of my former law school classmates, blood brothers in the fraternal order of ex-attorneys. And we take turns closing out the register. That evening, I returned home to find Adeline kneeling opposite Orion's cage, guarding the sleeping hedgehog with the intensity of a pediatric nurse. The ambient heat made even minor tasks, like removing my raincoat, feel like hard labor. I kissed the top of Adeline's head. "You're up late. Can I ask you something?" she asked. Her voice carried an ominous undertone, the same tone she used months earlier when she accused me of having an affair. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Do you think he's depressed?" It took me a moment to realize that she meant the hedgehog. "What does he have to be depressed about?" I poured myself a shot of warm bourbon from the decanter on the sideboard. He's got it darn good if you ask me. No hawks or jackals to hide from, an endless supply of mealworms and crickets. The varmint has pretty much hit the hedgehog jackpot. I think he's depressed, said Adeline. He looks depressed. I did my connubial duty, placing my face inches from the glass cage and examining the hedgehog at eye level. As far as I could tell, Orion looked no different than he had the previous afternoon. Languid, dopey, content. How could a creature be depressed when his brain was the size of a kumquat? I'm really worried, said Adeline. Mental illness is all too common in hedgehogs. I read an article online this morning. I tapped the glass. Orion cocked his snout. We could take him back and get another one, I proposed. I regretted the words as soon as they left my tongue. What the fuck is wrong with you, snapped Adeline. If you had a sick baby, you wouldn't take him back and get another one. Good thing we have a hedgehog, I thought, and not a baby. But I had a sense to keep the sentiment to myself. Instead, I attempted to wrap my arm around Adeline's shoulders to comfort her. She shook me off. I can't take this, Josh, I just can't. Not on top of Mom, cried Adeline. If he's not okay, I swear I'm going to jump out the window. Adeline's threat was not an idle one. We live on the 6th floor. When she thought I was cheating on her last February, she climbed out onto the ledge. After the police talked her down, she spent a week at Bellevue for observation. My girlfriend's father hanged himself in a hotel closet when she was 12 years old. My own mother overdosed on Darvon when I was 14. Sometimes I wonder if a family history of suicide is a healthy foundation for a relationship, but couples have been drawn together by stranger bonds. I know what he needs, I declared, fishing a treat from the jar of freeze-dried silkworms. Orion explored the snack with the tip of his rhinarium and then ingested it in one swift gulp. I think he's just hungry, I said. For a hedgehog with depression, he's got an awfully hearty appetite. Hedgehog depression is atypical, replied Adeline. The worse they feel, the more they eat. In the wild, unhappy hedgehogs can consume their own body weight in locusts over the course of several hours. We'll have to keep him on a strict diet and weigh him at least twice a day. Sorry, buddy, I apologized to Orion. But look on the bright side, Addie, I said. That means more freeze-dried silkworms for us. My girlfriend did not smile. Don't be an asshole, she warned. I'll stop there. Thank you.
You really didn't make my life easier there with the humor. That's a tough act to follow. We still have...
You should have brought a live bird.
I think I have a dead grasshopper, but that's about it. So, our fourth author would have been Elizabeth Collin. Oh, again, thank you, Jacob, for that tough act to follow. But Elizabeth Collin, who is not in our company, unless you're hiding somewhere, waiting for a dramatic entrance. Going once, going twice. Okay. Instead, here at the Montana Book Festival, we're all about the authors and their work, and we're going to open up the floor to a self-moderated Q&A. You guys can take questions. We encourage you to ask questions, otherwise it's going to be, 15 minutes of awkward pause and silence. So, without further ado, all yours.
Are you calling them or are we calling them?
Oh, it's self-moderated.
Well, I'm curious what everybody's ratio is of admitting it or denying it when people ask you, oh, is that me in that story?
To be honest, very few people in my family have ever approached me to ask about a character in the story and whether it was modeled on them. What happens to me more often is that friends come to me and they're convinced the story is about them. And there might be a detail in there that has something about their life or their characteristics, but the story is not about them. And I think it's actually worse for people to be told the story is not about them.
Some of my stories are inspired by people or ideas or events or something like that, but the stories are all 100% fiction, so that's what I tell people. It might be inspired by an idea or a person, but nothing in the story in any of my stories happened as it is, and a lot of my stories, as I move further along in my career, are 100% not inspired by anything except something weird that I see.
I can tell you I once received a letter from a woman in West Virginia, which began with something like, "My hedgehog is not an object of ridicule." And then accused me of hearing her life story and sharing it. So I agree that more often than not, the people who think they're in your stories are in your stories. I've learned over the years that arguably those people serve no purpose. If people want to believe that they're the basis for my story, that they were the model for the hedgehog, all the power to them.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a follow-up on that topic. So I know a writer who, fairly well-known, who writes a lot, has written a lot of stories based on facts, things that have happened to family, friends, and it's clear, it's pretty clear, it's so close to the facts that it's pretty obvious to people who read them that it's about them. And there's been some negative feedback about this. So I've wondered about the ethics about that before. One concern I have is that a writer has a certain power when they have their writings published that people who don't write have. So I just wondered if you'd care to comment on that. Does it make any sense? Does it
It does
sort
make
of question?
sense.
Yeah.
And I will say, I've written a memoir called Phoning Home, which I've had my parents, who are now quite old, promised they would never read. And so far they have stuck to it. But I think for me the ethical line, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, if you tell your own story, or stories that are part of your meaning, inevitably other stories, people's stories, will be caught up in them. And while you owe them a certain degree of respect to let them know or warning, it is at the core your story. In contrast, poaching other people's stories that are true, that really aren't your core story, to me is a very different animal, and that I would stay away from.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really write anything like that that's that close to the truth. That some of the stuff I've written in my earlier work was inspired by childhood things. But I do try to be careful and sensitive to what I do write, but it is my story. And the more fun part of it is to fictionalize. Like, to me, this is fiction, so you're not supposed to, I'm not writing a nonfiction story. So I think it's way more fun to just make stuff up.
Well, I have been asked a similar question before, and I always try to write with compassion for my characters, even if my characters are doing bad or stupid things, because we all do bad or stupid things at various times. And so I write with compassion for the characters, and I never ever set out with the intention to hurt someone's feelings. But I am a writer telling a story, and part of choosing to be a writer is that I know that sometimes I may wound people I love. And I try not to let that happen, but it does happen, and I have to live with that.
Thank you.
What is the secret to writing and the compression to write a short story? What's the secret of how do you know the beginning, the end? Just in general, the nice little short story at the beginning, the ending, the middle, and then you must practice, right?
Don't feel your hand gets tired.
Half the time I don't know where I'm going or what I'm doing. I sometimes get inspired by a title or a weird phrasing or something that I see, and I write everything down in a notebook in a stream of consciousness, and then when I start my story, I usually write a paragraph, and then I'm like, what happens? So half of the time I don't know where I'm going or what my ending is, and it takes me a minimum of 3 months to write a short story, closer to 5 to 6, because I agonize over every word and every paragraph and rewrite over and over and over again. So it's a very laborious process writing a short story, at least for me. very laborious.
Sure. I'm just curious, how many of you are writers?
Editor.
None of you say so. I guess my viewpoint is that the key is simply deciding in advance whether you're going to write a story or a novel or something else, and there are different art forms. The analogy I like to draw is in all those pre-18th century paintings where they painted the children as miniature adults, but children aren't miniature adults, and stories aren't miniature novels. And the people who get off on the wrong track craft-wise are the people who sort of view the story as an accordion that you just squeeze in, and it's really an entirely different animal.
Well, I have a couple of responses to that. One is that I generate a lot of material that never makes it into the story. I probably write 10 or 12 pages for every page that ends up in the story. I just try to create as much material to work with as I can, because then at least I have something I can start refining and revising. And if I really am struggling with a story, and this will sound weird, but I tell myself that I'm not creating the story already exists. It's out there somewhere. It's whole, it's complete, and it's perfect. And it is my job just to discover what that story is by chipping away at the stuff that isn't the story. And hopefully I'm left with something that lives up to that delusion of mine, that useful delusion.
Definitely. Can you talk about your process of revising? Because it seems like sometimes, like when I started a short story, it feels like there's a very like spiritual, like stumbly part to it. But like in later drafts, when I'm trying to figure out like what is the story that is currently there, like if I sort of like switch like mind frames to more like rational aspect, which like sort of like deadens the language, interferes with the pacing. So it's like, how do you like sort of capture like the spontaneity and flow in an original draft? When you're sort of tinkering with that, like getting it down into something rational and artificial.
Well, I would say, first of all, first drafts, just get them down as quickly as you can. Don't fuss with them, don't tinker with the sentences. So much of it is not going to end up in the story. But then again, you have a mass of material that you can work with. I would also say that it's not unusual for a story to take a long time and a lot of effort. One of the stories in this book I worked on for 2 years. And I knew what the story was. I pretty much had an idea of what was going to happen in the story and how it was going to be shaped. And I could not get it to work. I didn't write every day on that story for 2 years, but I would put it away, I would take it out, I would put it away, I would take it out. And one day a sentence came to me. And these sentences come from who knows where, because they feel as if they don't come from inside you, they come from somewhere else. And that one sentence turned my idea of the story on its head. And I realized that the story was actually the opposite of what I thought it was. And I got out of the way and let that particular character tell the story. And then it worked. I don't know that that's helpful at all.
I really have to know who my character is. If I don't know who that character is, I really struggle with the story. Like, would this guy really do that, or say that, or think that? I write a different way. I wish I was one of those writers that could just write a draft, but I have this horrible habit of having to reread what I write and be happy and satisfied with that paragraph before I can move on. And that is partially why it takes me so long to write a story. I just wrote a story that it took me from February to July to write, but that amount of time paid off because it's now shortlisted for a prize. So I would just say that, you know, take your time, don't rush, and just like really try to know like who your character is and what they're thinking and what they're seeing. Like, I really try to immerse myself in that world, and that helps me.
I'll echo that. Obviously, if you have a method that works that is not mine, take anything I say with many grains of salt. But Grace Pally used to say that she did her best writing in the bathtub. So some of my students today, I now have to explain that does not mean she brought her laptop in and was electrocution. It meant that she thought through what she wanted to do well in advance. And I think with many of my students, the challenge they face is they start too soon and they end too late. What you want to do is you want to really conceptualize your story, know who the characters are, have some sense of where you're going at the outset. Sort of like going on a family vacation. If you don't choose a destination, your kids are going to be very upset if you just start driving and see what you're at. And on the other hand, at the end, often stories are organically finished, and after you've done enough revising, people keep changing them, and they don't make them better, they just make them different. So containing yourself in that way to me is crucial.
Have other people read your work too. It's really helpful to have people read your work and say, I don't really understand what you're talking about or what this person is doing. Or my last story, my friend said, your character wouldn't do that. And I said, oh yeah, you're right. So it's really helpful to have other people look at your work and understand it because you're so close to it. Sometimes you can't separate. Include that.
I have one more comment because you mentioned this word flow, and that's something that I talk about to my students and my fellow writers. There was a book that came out about 20 years ago called Flow, an Optimal State of Psychology. You may have read it. Sometimes when I have been working on something very intently for a long time, and this happens in all kinds of different professions and tasks, it's just a state of mind that you get into where you're very focused and you can get into an almost hypnotic state or a dream state. And I don't know how to tell you how to voluntarily bring that on, but when you're in that state, it's a terrific place to be because you start making connections that you wouldn't have made otherwise. You start seeing patterns that you wouldn't have made otherwise. You're in touch with a more intuitive or emotional part of yourself or part of your brain. So if I have a friend who says, write with a loose grip, and it's kind of like that. You kind of want to be loose enough that you're not constraining yourself, but you kind of have to have a little control over the material as well. So you aim for that sweet spot where you get into that state.
I was wondering what you think as the essence of short story, and does that contrast with maybe the essence of a novel, if it's different, whatever you're feeling.
Jacob?
Yes, I think a short story really needs to be able to be condensed to a log line or a premise. So my story that you heard part of, couple adopt a hedgehog, but its depression unravels their relationship. If you can't sum up your story in that concise way, you're probably working on a longer project.
I don't write novels, so I'm primarily a short story writer. So, but I mean, there's stories that I have that people have said to me, can you expand them and what happens? So I just think it depends. There's always a kernel. You can always expand something depending on what the story is, I guess. I just can't ever think of anything to write for 200 pages.
I never tried to write a short story, so
It's different. Yeah. I like to examine different subjects. That's partially why I love short stories. You can be different characters and be different places in different time periods and examine different things that people are thinking. And to me, that's very attractive to look at different people instead of living with the same character for, years and years and years. I like the variety.
I think there are rare times, I wish they happened more often, when the story comes very quickly to me and I can get through it in a short period of time. And that's a great thing about writing short stories because you're not committed to it for the next 5 years. But at the same time, I think some of my stories are very novelistic and that I hope that when the reader reaches the end of the story, they're still thinking about those characters and what those characters do next and where they go next and who they become. And in a way, that's the writer inviting the reader in to be a part of the creative process. Sure.
What?
You ever write in present tense?
No, not you. Oh wait, my first story is in present tense. Typically, I always write in past, but I do switch. I write first person, I write third person. I have found lately that I write better in first. Most of the stories that story I read was in third. That's a very early story that I wrote. I selected it also because a lot of my stories have a lot of cussing in it, so I wasn't sure how that was going to go over. So But mostly, no, I mostly don't write in present, mostly in past. But I do switch perspectives a lot. But I want to echo about what you said about how stories come easy to you. Is I had a teacher that said to me, you'll have 2 stories, maybe 3 in your life that'll come to you like that. And you'll write them really fast, and then the rest is a battle. So I find that to be very true. The first story in my book, which sold the collection, I wrote in a week. As I told you, the last story took me 6 months. So.
And don't you think it's partly a result of long practice that those stories come to you as a kind of gift?
Yeah, and I mean, I wish I had a gift come soon because every story I 6 months. It's like a minute of 5-6 months. I'm like, oh, I wish I could just like write it in a week. But I haven't written a story that fast in like 5 years.
I would say if a story naturally occurs to you in the first person or in the present tense, you should certainly make that work for the story. All other things being equal, it's worth noting that the majority of literary fiction submitted to major publishers is written in the first person, and a large plurality of it is written in the present tense. However, a majority, overwhelming majority, of the first novels published by these houses is written in the past tense in the third person. So it may suggest that it seems easier to write a good novel in the first person present than it really is. And the skill involved in putting something in the third person past actually is a harder barrier than we might think.
Yeah, I was told to mostly put stuff in the past. I don't know why, but they said it's better to write in past tense.
I don't think I've ever written in present tense.
I've gotten so hooked on it that when I read, I start editing it out. Present tense.
So there's been only one mention that I've noticed so far of giving a story to someone else to read, getting feedback. And I'm wondering if any of you work with a great editor or a respected reader when you're in process, or do you get the whole shebang done and then give it to somebody to edit, either professionally or just to get some feedback?
I'm lucky because I have a lot of friends who are writers, but I try not to impose on them too much. And sometimes I don't want to share a story because I feel very protective of it, because I'm not certain about exactly what I'm doing or where it's going. And there are other times where it's at a point where I think, okay, I don't have as much perspective on this as I would like, so I want someone else to look at it. And that can be extremely helpful at times.
Like I said, I've worked with a wide range of publishers, from commercial big five publishers to publishers that publish about 3 books a year. And the take-home advice I've gotten that works for me is you only want to take advice from people who have a vested interest in what you're doing. So if someone has bought your book and they want to change it, it may not mean they're right, but it means they're actually thinking through what they're telling you. If someone tells you that if you change your book, they might buy it, find someone else to buy your book.
I send it to probably 5 to 10 people to look at once it's completed. I work as a television producer as my main job, so I don't have a lot of writer friends. I did a literary program in Portugal in 2017, and I met somebody there who's a writer. So she's my one writer friend. The rest are just friends and family. And believe me, my dad has told me what he's thought about a lot of my stories, and doesn't like some of them. So I do get real feedback.
As a former editor, I found that some people, just one phrase, I think Bradley mentioned, sometimes just a sentence switches it, the whole thing turns on a dime or takes shape or gains a different focus, and it's sometimes such a minor word or phrase or suggestion.
A good editor is a treasure, and when you can find one, hang on to them for dear life. Anybody else? Yep.
Yeah, I have a question about audience. I was thinking about the relationship between the writer and the audience. I got Toni Morrison in a quote about how Beloved wasn't written for white people, or Will Finnegan said something along the lines of when he was writing, his active writing took off and he moved it from a form of self-expression towards a form of an audience. Or Kurt Vonnegut saying like don't write with the window open because you'll catch pneumonia. But like when you guys write, do you like consider audience as something that like is part of the process, or like how much does audience influence your writing? I guess
I don't
if
think,
it does at all.
I don't,
Yeah.
I don't think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I write more for me, I think, and I try to write from my heart most of the time with what I feel. And I think if you write honestly and from your heart and something that you're passionate about, there will be an audience for it. There's an audience for, you know, it just depends. You know, my audience may be women or young girls or old men or whatever it is. I think as long as you write honestly and you're a good writer, you'll find an audience. I think you should be less worried about that.
I completely agree with that. Unless you are writing a certain kind of genre fiction where you know that there's a kind of built-in audience that you're aiming for, I never think about it. I write for myself because I feel like I'm more of a perfectionist than I would like to be, and if I can write a story that satisfies me, there's going to be somebody else out there that satisfies you, even if it's my grandmother. But somebody will see some value in it, and otherwise I never think about it.
I would just add, be suspicious of what famous authors tell you. Toni Morrison or Philip Roth come in and say, this is how I write. Remember, their occupation is lying for a living. So it may be that they're actually just saying what sounds good, but more likely, they've done this so long and are so good at it, they reinvent their understanding of it in a way that might work for them in hindsight, but can't work for mere mortals like you or me going forward.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Kind of along those lines, someone, I either said it or I read it, said there's actually two stories, one for the reader and one for the writer, and the job of the writer is to find out in the course of putting the story together all the stuff that's in there for him and take it out. And one of the first things I wrote was huge. It just went on forever. I think it was close to 1,000 pages. There were so many people, so many plots, so much stuff going on. And I sent it to somebody to read, and she pretty much, in essence, kind of came back to me with the same kind of stuff. And I thought, oh my goodness sakes, yeah, all this stuff is just for me. And all these stupid jokes, they're just for me. And I've got to get them out there. What do you think about that?
I think I'm speechless. you guys want to jump in?
You've never encountered that kind of thing.
Again, first of all, I would not show my work to anybody that I don't know very well and trust. And secondly, unless it's one of those people, I don't care. I don't care what you think about it. That makes me sound like a jerk, and I probably am a jerk, but I work very hard at what I do. I try to make it as good as I possibly can. And people I respect tell me whether they agree with that or not, and I will listen to them, and I don't much care about anybody else's opinion.
But you have students and they write stuff. You ever see that kind of a dynamic in what they're writing?
You know, I don't really. I see these days. I see students writing very compact, shorter stories. I mean, they're not these big sprawling sagas. They're very focused and directed for the most part. I don't know.
No, I agree. I think the days of the epic novel and the sprawling postmodern wonder have at least temporarily taken a hiatus.
Yay.
You could reinvigorate them. This could be your moment.
I think I just finished reading The Company or something. It's so big that if you drop it, I would break it.
That's another panel entirely. We work on this scale. So.
I mean, we believe in this like great literary project, but the reality is as paper prices go up, book sizes go down. They have a spring line of books and a fall line of books, and only so much glue.
You are so practical and worldly. I said nice to you, but I want you to be my friend.
Anytime. I have a bridge to sell you.
Remind us of the titles of your books, please.
Chain Link Stories.
How I Met You.
And even though I read from Einstein's Beach House, what they have here, I believe, is Millard Salter's last day. It's,
Yeah.
maybe not. We'll find out.
Hey everybody, we're about to wrap up. The event is closing down here at Shakespeare. That doesn't mean you have to go home. In fact, I think Garth and Lorna would appreciate you stayed around and, peruse the shelves. But once again, can we get a round of applause for our authors here? Michelle, Jacob, Mr. Owens.